Joining me now is Labour's Shadow Health Minister Justin Madders and the former Conservative Chief Whip Andrew Mitchell. If I can start with you, Andrew, what happens now? This is a political pickle, isn't it, for the government?
Well, none of this stuff is easy, but I do think we have to see whether the measures which were announced yesterday, and they're very significant measures too in terms of the 3 tiers of lockdown, whether they can provide what we need. And I very much hope they will, because if we have to go to a national lockdown and nothing can be ruled out, then that will have a very severe effect indeed on the economy. So my hope is that the measures that the Prime Minister has announced will be successful, working hand in glove with the mayors, who are very important to this process, and that it will not be necessary to move to what Keir Starmer has described today.
But you know that SAGE recommended this 3 weeks ago. They've been ignored. They've slagged off the test and trace system because they don't think it's working. Tomorrow, 2 more scientific advisors will say that thousands more lives could be saved by doing this if the government listens. Why won't they?
Well, the government is certainly listening to...
Not to SAGE.
Well, the government is certainly listening, but all the voices do not say the same thing. And while it is true that the paper that has been revealed from SAGE suggested that this should happen earlier, nevertheless, there are other scientific voices which take a different view. And the Prime Minister must listen to all these views and must then steer this very narrow course between making sure that the NHS is able to cope and lives are saved on the one hand, and that we don't destroy our economy upon which so many lives and livelihoods depend.
And yet tonight they just call Sir Keir a shameless opportunist. Now, most people around the country would be saying, well, hang on, if you look at the science and you listen to what SAGE, the government's own advisors, are saying, and you follow that, that's not political opportunism. That sounds like common sense. Well,
I think it's very important that politicians work well together. This is not a political crisis, this is a health crisis. And for example, in the West Midlands, under our Mayor, Andy Street, people who've never agreed on anything political have worked extremely well together.
And Andy Street thinks that the government's got its restrictions and its tiers wrong because he's put your part of the world, the West Midlands, Birmingham, into the same tier as Manchester, even though the numbers are much lower.
That is true, and both Andy Street and I pressed Boris Johnson not to bump up the Birmingham area. But nevertheless, the small change that's been made there, we now accept, and we've got to make this work. And my point is that politicians who've never agreed in the West Midlands have all joined together and have agreed now. We're doing our very best. The curve has been flattened significantly in the West Midlands, and we need to see this happening in other areas of the country, particularly in the north, where, as you suggested, the figures are very much worse.
And it doesn't feel as if, peace has broken out in the Tory ranks tonight, to be fair. You've got 42 backbenchers rebelling against him. You've got former advisors saying he's got to take the party with him. You've got, from Nick's impression, of a slightly glib encounter with the 1922 committee you were on. Was that tone deaf?
Well, I think that the Prime Minister has an incredibly difficult course to steer, as I said. And there are people who have a principled view on this, who are trying to make sure we get the balance right, and their voices are being heard.
So bluntly, he can't do this lockdown now. He can't do a short circuit, right?
I think he will be guided by events. But my point is that the measures that have been announced this week, they must be given a chance to succeed.
Justin Madders, I want to go back to this line of calling Keir Starmer a shameless opportunist. It doesn't look like the PM will be on board with your circuit break. You've got to assume that that won't happen, right?
Well, we don't know yet. I really struggle to understand how you can call someone an opportunist who is agreeing with the scientific advisors. It seems to me a rather ludicrous statement to make. I think the question has to be, why is Boris Johnson not agreeing with his own scientific advisors? What is stopping him from doing what is the action that's needed to take?
We're having problems with your line. I'm going to try again. Hopefully we could adjust whatever is distorting the sound a bit. I want to try and understand what you're actually asking for, because the details were fairly sparse. You've called it a 2 or 3 week circuit break. Obviously, there's a big difference in terms of the economics, and we don't know what happens after that. Does it definitely end after 3 weeks, or could it be extended? Is it a watch and wait? Could it go on like the March one did for several months in places?
Well, clearly we don't want it to go on any longer than is necessary. The 2 to 3 week period is actually what SAGE have been advising themselves, and we think if it's taken over the half-term period towards the end of the month, that would be the time in terms of minimal disruption to children, for example. We clearly want to be very cautious about the gap of it because we don't want to come out of things too quickly. Right. But clearly the idea of this is actually to buy us a bit of time to get us in a better in the winter months.
OK, so it could be longer. I mean, you're saying hopeful, which sounds like if we went into it thinking 2 or 3 weeks, it could be longer. We don't know what the cost will be. We've heard several times today that it would cost more to delay this, but we still don't know. If people are listening to Labour tonight, is it full furlough? Is it 80% of wages paid? Are you going to pay out the 14 billion a month that we saw the Chancellor take on? I mean, is that what you're saying this time round?
Well, I think the question is, can we afford not to do this?
No, it's not. The question is, have you worked out the costs? I'm so sorry, that is my question tonight. How much is it actually going to cost to do this when you don't know quite how long it will be? Because that will depend on whether you take the country, businesses, employees with you.
Well, we're clear that we need to support businesses and individuals in a period of lockdown. I think one of the problems that's been apparent over the last few days is that should have been introduced, and the financial support hasn't been there, which is why we've not had the level of buy-in from council leaders and other elected mayors and so on. I think it's very important that we're very clear at this stage that financial support has to go hand in hand with any restrictions that are introduced, and of course reform to test and trace. We can't go into December with the level of cases going up the way it is at the moment. If we do that, we will be in an absolutely terrible position. I'm just going to go back to Andrew Mitchell whilst you try and have another go at your sound. Do you accept, Andrew, that if the government had actually worked out the economics of the 3 tiers of restrictions, then that wouldn't be putting this pressure on you now, that people would have said, we'll go into the higher restrictions because actually it makes sense economically? That was an open goal for the government and it missed.
Well, I think that the 3 tiers in principle are the correct thing to do. There is a problem in the West Midlands because we would rather have had 1 and a bit rather than move into the second tier. But I think that in principle, to get the balance right between protecting jobs and livelihoods and the economy on the one hand and the NHS on the other, the 3-tier system must be given a chance to work.
Yeah, and I guess just to try you again, Justin, I mean, we know that there are parts of rural England, there are parts of the southwest, there are virtually no cases that don't need a circuit break at all. So I wonder why you'd put all that extra cost and anxiety and frustration on people who might look round their own communities and their own neighbourhoods and say, we don't need this, why are we trapped in this?
Well, virtually every part of the country is seeing an increase in cases, and the R number is above 1 just about everywhere. And I think it's really a question of timing more than anything. We know the direction of travel is taking, and it's going in the wrong direction at the moment. So I think this principle playing it next thing to do.
Thank you both very much. I do apologise for the sound problems, but thanks for joining us.